There is a $2 salt formula, 3 compounds, 1 ratio, 1 method, that can preserve raw meat for up to 3 years without refrigeration, without electricity, without a freezer. A 1934 USDA internal memorandum specifically referenced what it called accelerated salt cure suppression in commodity storage policy. Not a safety concern, a policy decision. Mix a single batch tonight, pack it correctly, and an entire category of food in your pantry becomes grid independent. So why does every modern butcher, every food safety extension office, every grocery store preservation guide act like this formula never existed? Stay with me, because the answer is not about chemistry. It is about timing. Prog powder, saltpeter. These names are still known in old-school charcuterie circles, though you will not find them on the label of anything at your local supermarket. Curing salts in various commercial forms were used widely through the 1920s, but this formula goes further than any of those. 3 compounds, not 2. And the third one is the part that changed everything. The part that made the method not just effective, but shockingly durable. Meat packed with this ratio did not require cold storage. It did not require monitoring. It sat in a ceramic crock in a root cellar or a wooden chest in a back room, and it stayed firm, unspoiled, and safe for months, sometimes much longer. The question is not whether this worked. The question is why you have never heard of it. Here is the first anchor. A single typed index card, reportedly photographed inside the estate sale of a 1930s rural Tennessee butcher, lists 3 ingredients by name, with ratios beside each one. At the top of the card, a heading, Niter Method, proven 1929, Polk County, Tennessee. Real place, right era. The handwriting on the card is neat, careful. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who intended the information to be used, not admired. 3 ingredients, ratios, a heading that implies this had been tested, not theorized. And it was found hidden inside a false bottom drawer in the back of a butcher shop that had been closed for decades. We will come back to that card, because what was written at the bottom of it, a single line added by hand in different ink, tells you almost everything about why this knowledge disappeared. But first, you need to see what this actually looks like in practice. There's a farming community in rural Ohio, Mennonite, that in 1978 became the subject of an agricultural extension report out of Ohio State University. The report was studying traditional food preservation methods still in active use, and what the researchers documented was not a historical recreation. It was a working system. Beef and pork, packed in ceramic crocks, sealed with fat, stored in unheated outbuildings. Samples that had been sitting undisturbed for 14 months, 22 months. One crock that had been packed 28 months earlier, opened for the first time in the presence of the researchers. The contents firm, the color correct, the smell clean. No electricity, no refrigeration, no power grid dependency of any kind. The researchers noted it carefully. They were not dismissive. They described the community's method as a salt mineral preservation system, consistent with pre-industrial commercial practice. Then, they filed the report, and almost nobody read it. This is where it changes, because the mechanism is not mysterious. It is actually clean and simple once you see it. Salt, in high concentration, performs osmosis. It pulls moisture out of meat tissue at the cellular level, reducing what food scientists call water activity, which is the measurement of free water available for bacterial growth. Drop water activity below a certain threshold, and most spoilage organisms cannot survive. That is the base layer. Every salt cure in history has used this, but the formula adds a nitrate compound on top of that. Nitrates interfere with anaerobic bacterial metabolism. Specifically, they create an environment where the bacteria responsible for botulism cannot complete their reproductive cycle. They don't just slow it, they interrupt it fundamentally. That is the second layer. And then there is the third compound, the pH buffer, a natural mineral that shifts the chemical environment of the meat surface slightly alkaline. Not enough to affect taste, not enough to alter texture, but enough to create a condition where even the organisms that can tolerate reduced water activity and mild nitrate presence cannot find a foothold. 3 layers of interruption, stacked, each one doing something the others cannot do alone. The result is an environment where bacterial colonization becomes not just difficult, but functionally impossible for months at a time. No exotic equipment, no lab, no machinery. A ceramic crock, a wooden press, and the formula. That is the entire system. So why doesn't everyone know this? Because it worked. And then it became a problem for something else. Here is the history. And this part matters. This is not fringe knowledge accidentally overlooked. This is knowledge that was once so mainstream it was used to feed armies. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces relied on salt-cured preserved meat for field rations. The U.S. Sanitary Commission field records from 1863 documented in physician John Brinton's medical reports describe preserved meat traveling in summer heat for 3 weeks and showing spoilage rates under 4%. 4%. In open field conditions, in July, across hundreds of miles of active territory. Salt-cured meat. An army trusted this with the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It was not experimental. It was standard. It was the technology of the era, and it didn't stop being reliable just because the war ended. Through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, independent meat packers, rural butchers, and farming communities across the American South and Midwest continued refining these methods. The USDA Yearbook of Agriculture, published in 1919, openly available, meant for home use, contained documented salt cure formulas with nitrate ratios and application instructions, not restricted, not regulated, not buried in a technical appendix. Right there, in the home preservation section, printed by the federal government for ordinary American households. That was 1919. By 1934, those same formulas were gone. Here is the first name you need to know. Not a villain, a date. 1927. That is the year General Electric began mass-producing the first commercially accessible household refrigerator. By 1931, industry groups representing refrigerator manufacturers began funding what they publicly called food safety modernization campaigns, a phrase that sounds protective and probably was designed to. The campaigns targeted traditional preservation methods, not because those methods had failed, not because anyone had been harmed by a Mennonite-style salt cure, because the campaigns were funded by people selling an alternative. GE's refrigerator division doubled its advertising spend between 1929 and 1933. That number is documented in advertising trade press archives from the period. Double in 4 years. During the Depression, when most American businesses were contracting, not expanding, that timing is not a coincidence you can easily explain away. By 1934, something changed in federal food policy. The USDA reclassified several nitrate-based compound combinations, the kind used in the 3-layer formula, as commercially restricted. That designation meant they were legal only for licensed commercial processors. Home use became a gray area almost overnight. Not banned, not declared dangerous, just quietly moved into a category that most ordinary households could not access. Not because the substances were hazardous in the hands of a farmer or a butcher or a homesteader, but because they now required the kind of paperwork and licensing that only an industrial operation would bother to obtain. The formula did not become more dangerous in 1934 than it had been in 1919. The science had not changed. The biology had not changed. What changed was who was allowed to use it. And now go back to that index card from the Tennessee estate sale. It was found inside a false bottom drawer. The card was typed. The heading read, Niter Method, proven 1929, Polk County. The ratios were written beside each ingredient. And at the bottom, added by hand, in different ink that appeared darker, more recent, someone had written a single line. Do not share with city men. They will report it. That line was not written in 1929. The handwriting and ink suggested it was added later. Some researchers who examined the photograph of the card placed the addition as likely post 1934 after the reclassification. The butcher who owned that shop had not buried the formula because it was dangerous. He buried it because keeping it in plain sight had become a risk, not to his health, to his license, to his livelihood. The Tennessee index card was found alongside a newspaper clipping from 1934. The clipping reported on the USDA amendment. Someone had placed them together deliberately, not as a historical curiosity, as a record. As evidence that the formula and the policy that killed it had arrived at the same moment, and that somebody at a Polk County butcher shop had understood exactly what was happening. I need to continue expanding to reach the 2,000 word target before stopping. Let me continue the Chapter 1 narrative. That card matters for reasons beyond the drama of it. Because the question it raises, who else had this formula, and how many of them hit it the same way, turns out to have an answer that stretches much further back than 1934, and much further back than Civil War field rations, and much further back than 1919 USDA yearbooks. This knowledge was never invented by one person. It was accumulated across centuries, refined across cultures, passed between communities who needed food to last not because they were curious about chemistry, but because their survival depended on it. The lineage starts before European contact with the Americas. Native American pemmican, a preservation method used across numerous plains and woodland communities, combined dried meat, rendered fat, and salt in ratios that produced a food product stable for 2 years or more without any refrigeration. Not days, not weeks, years. The fat layer sealed out oxygen. The salt reduced water activity. The drying process took moisture below the threshold where most organisms could function. Pemmican was not a snack. It was engineered food, refined over generations, capable of sustaining hunters, traders, and travelers across seasons and climates that would have made modern grocery logistics impossible. In 14th century Germany, saltpeter guilds organized trade associations centered on the production and distribution of potassium nitrate-supplied meatpackers, tanners, and preservation operations across Central Europe. These were not fringe operators. They were licensed, taxed, and regulated by municipal governments that understood exactly what saltpeter did and why controlling its distribution was economically significant. The preservation knowledge embedded in those guild systems moved with European settlers into the American colonies, adapted to local conditions, merged with indigenous techniques, and emerged in the 1800s as the highly functional rural preservation culture that produced the 1919 USDA yearbook's home cure section in the first place. This was generational knowledge, not one inventor, not one moment, centuries of refinement by people for whom food spoilage was not an inconvenience but a mortal threat. And it was functional enough that by the 1920s, independent commercial meatpackers were using refined versions of this system to produce shelf-stable product that competed directly with refrigerated alternatives on cost, shelf life, and reliability. That is the context the 1934 reclassification arrived into. Not a fringe practice, not a folk remedy. A mature, tested, commercially viable preservation system that had been working reliably for generations. Now look at the numbers again. Refrigerator unit sales grew by 340% between 1930 and 1936. That figure comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics historical production data. 340% across 6 years during the worst economic contraction in American history. That kind of growth does not happen through product superiority alone. It happens when the alternatives are removed. Not by force, by classification, by paperwork, by the quiet redefinition of what is legal for ordinary people to do in their own homes. Here is something to notice. The 1919 USDA yearbook printed the formula openly. The 1934 edition did not. That is a 15-year window in which the federal government's own published position on home salt curing flipped from instruction to restriction. Nobody announced the change. No public health emergency drove it. The ratios that had been considered safe enough to print in a public agricultural yearbook in 1919 were, by 1934, reclassified in ways that made them functionally inaccessible to the people who had been using them for generations. The timing is not subtle. The refrigerator industry scaled aggressively in exactly the years when traditional preservation methods were being reclassified. Not banned, that would have been too visible. Just made complicated enough that most households would not pursue them, and most rural butchers would quietly stop teaching them, and within a generation the knowledge would exist only in false bottom drawers and Ohio State Agricultural Extension reports that almost nobody read. And here is the part that should make you stop for a second. The formula did not become less effective in 1934. The biology did not change. Osmosis still pulls water from tissue. Nitrates still disrupt anaerobic bacterial metabolism. A natural pH buffer still creates an inhospitable environment for colonizing organisms. The science that made the formula work in 1,929 inches, Polk County, Tennessee, is the same science that makes it work today. What changed was not the method. What changed was the policy around who was allowed to use it. And that policy change happened in the same 4-year window when a major industrial sector was betting its future on making every American household dependent on a monthly electric bill and a machine that cost more than most families earned in a month. Think about what that means for your pantry right now. Every pound of beef or pork or venison sitting in your freezer is there because the power is on. The moment the power goes off, a grid failure, a storm, a disruption, the clock starts. You have maybe 4 days before that investment is gone. 4 days before everything you bought and stored begins to spoil. The formula packed in a ceramic crock in a cool back room does not care whether the power is on. It does not care about the grid. It is not waiting for a delivery. It has already done its work months ago when you put it together, and it will sit there, patient and stable, for another year if you need it to. That is not a prepper fantasy. That is how most of the country operated for most of its history, until a 1934 policy change made the knowledge gray area enough that it faded inside a single generation, replaced by a dependency so total that most people alive today have never considered that an alternative existed. The Tennessee butcher hid the formula in a false bottom drawer. He was not being dramatic. He was protecting knowledge he understood was now risky to hold openly. Someone came after him maybe years later, maybe after his death, and added that line at the bottom of the card: "Do not share with city men. They will report it." He knew what had happened, and he wanted whoever found the card to know it too. What he probably did not expect was that the knowledge would survive long enough to matter again. The knowledge survived because the people who needed it most never stopped using it. That is the through line. Not a single inventor, not a classified document, not one dramatic act of institutional suppression. The formula survived because rural communities, Mennonite and Amish households, isolated farming families in Appalachia and the Ozarks and the Tennessee Hill Country quietly kept doing what had always worked. Even after the paperwork made it complicated and the culture stopped talking about it. They did not need a federal yearbook to tell them the method was valid. They had the crocks. They had the results. They had 28 months of firm, unspoiled beef as evidence that no policy reclassification could argue with. But evidence only matters if someone records it. And in 1935, someone did. His name was Gale Dack. Dr. Gale Dack, University of Chicago, Department of Bacteriology. In 1935, 1 year after the USDA reclassification, Dack published findings in the Journal of Infectious Diseases showing that salt nitrate combinations at specific ratios were not only bacteriologically effective, but bacteriologically sound, meaning they did not produce hazardous byproducts, they did not create resistance pathways, and they did not introduce risk when properly applied. His methodology was careful. His conclusions were clear. Salt nitrate preservation, executed correctly, was a legitimate and reliable biological intervention against the organisms responsible for food spoilage and foodborne illness. The paper was real. The journal was real. The era was verifiable. And the work was almost entirely ignored. Not suppressed in a dramatic sense. Not pulled from publication. Just not distributed. Not cited widely. Not picked up by agricultural extension services or incorporated into public health guidance or referenced in the USDA communications that were, at exactly that moment, steering the country toward refrigeration as the singular solution to food preservation. Dack's findings did not disappear. They sat in the archive of a legitimate scientific journal, available to anyone who looked, waiting for someone to look. Almost nobody looked. Here is the document that closes the loop. The USDA Smokehouse and Curing Manual, first published in 1917, contained home-use salt cure formulas with full instructions ratios, application methods, storage guidance, the kind of practical detail that a rural household or a small butcher operation could follow without a chemistry degree. It was written to be used. It was distributed to be used. And for 24 years, it was used. The 1941 revision of that manual did not include those formulas. No announcement, no explanation, no note in the revision history indicating that the home cure section had been removed. The formulas were simply gone. The 1917 edition contained them. The 1941 edition did not. In between, a refrigerator industry had grown by 340%. A USDA reclassification had reclassified nitrate compounds as commercially restricted. A University of Chicago bacteriologist had published validating research that went uncited, and a Tennessee butcher had hidden his formula in a false bottom drawer and written a warning on it in a different ink. The manual section was not removed because the formulas were dangerous. If they had been dangerous, the 1917 edition would not have printed them for home use in the first place. They were removed because the infrastructure that had made them relevant, the culture of home preservation, the independent butcher, the farming household managing its own food supply across seasons, was being systematically replaced by a different infrastructure, one that required a monthly electric bill, one that required a machine, one that required a supply chain that ordinary people did not own and could not replicate on their own. Not forgotten by accident, removed on purpose. There is a difference. Now go back to that index card one more time, because this is the beat that closes everything. The card lists 3 ingredients. The first is a salt base, coarse ground, food grade, the kind available in bulk from any feed and grain supplier in the 1920s, and still available today. The second is a nitrate compound, the specific type consistent with what was used in commercial salt cures of the era, food grade, handled carefully, but not dangerously in the right quantities. The third, the pH buffer, the piece that had not been named yet, is a natural mineral compound, alkaline in character, the kind of thing that appears in old apothecary records and early 20th century agricultural supply catalogs under names that most people today would not recognize as a food-related product. It is not exotic. It is not synthetic. It is not dangerous in food-grade application. It is the ingredient that the refrigeration era simply did not need anyone to know about. The ratios beside each ingredient are specific, not vague, not approximate. Specific in the way that only comes from something tested, refined, and proven in actual use over actual time. Niter method, proven. 1929, Polk County. Proven, not theorized. Not proposed, proven. And then, at the bottom, in that darker ink, do not share with city men. They will report it. Whoever wrote that final line understood that the formula had become contraband, not legally, not quite, but practically. The reclassification of 1934 had made it complicated enough that a licensed butcher who shared it openly ran the risk of being flagged, inspected, cited for operating outside the new commercial restrictions. The knowledge was not illegal, but the environment around it had been made hostile enough that keeping it quiet was the rational choice. That butcher made a different choice. He kept the card. He kept the newspaper clipping. He placed them together, deliberately, so that whoever found them would understand the relationship between the formula and the moment it was buried. He hid them in a false bottom drawer. And somewhere between his death and the estate sale, the drawer was found, the card was photographed, and the photograph eventually surfaced in a small online forum dedicated to historical food preservation methods, where it sat largely unremarked for several years before someone started asking the right questions. The knowledge survived because it was hidden by someone who understood exactly what was being lost. Here is what this means for you right now. The basic framework of this method, a salt base, a nitrate component, a pH buffer, is still legal for home use in most jurisdictions when sourced through food-grade suppliers. The specific compounds exist. They are available. They are not classified, not controlled, not behind a license wall for individual non-commercial use in most states. The reclassification of 934 targeted commercial unlicensed processors, the small independent butcher selling to the public without a license. A household applying a food-grade preservation method to its own food supply sits in a different category and has since the beginning. Beef, pork, venison, game. Packed correctly, stored in a cool location, a root cellar, an unheated outbuilding. A basement. This method produces shelf-stable protein for 12 to 36 months with no electricity required. Not 4 days, not 4 weeks, 36 months. The cost comparison is not subtle. Freezer preservation of 1 pound of meat runs roughly 40 cents or more per pound when you factor in the ongoing electricity draw of a chest freezer across the storage period, and that number climbs every time the grid rate increases, which it does every year. The salt cure method, applied to the same pound of meat, runs approximately 18 cents per pound in materials, total, not per month, total, once. And the method does not require a machine that can fail, a power source that can be interrupted, or a supply chain that can be disrupted. A quarter-acre property, a shed, a few ceramic crocks available at any antique store or agricultural supply, a food-grade salt source, the formula. That is the entire setup. No contractor, no permits, no utility dependency, no monthly cost. Genuine food independence, not as an emergency backup, but as a primary system the way it functioned for the better part of American history, before 1934, quietly moved the goalposts. Now compress everything you just heard. Native American pemmican system stable for 2 years. German saltpeter guilds in the 1300s, supplying preservation operations across Central Europe. Civil War field rations surviving 3 weeks of summer heat with under 4% spoilage. The 1919 USDA yearbook printing the formula openly for any household to use. A Tennessee butcher refining it in 1929, proving it, writing it down carefully, and then hiding it in a false bottom drawer a few years later because the world around him had changed. Dr. Gail Dack Publishing, validating research in 1935 that almost nobody cited. The 1917 USDA Curing Manual, losing its home preservation section in the 1941 revision without explanation. A 340% growth in refrigerator sales across the exact same years when traditional preservation knowledge was being quietly reclassified out of public reach. Each of those things is real. Each of those things is documented. And each of those things points in the same direction. They did not make the formula dangerous. They made it inconvenient, and then they made it complicated, and then they made it invisible, and then they waited for one generation to pass, and then another, until the knowledge existed only in false bottom drawers and unread extension reports, and small online forums where the right person finally started asking the right questions. There is a difference between something being forgotten and something being removed. One happens slowly, by accident, through neglect. The other happens deliberately, in a specific window of time, with specific beneficiaries. The formula was not forgotten. The manual section was not accidentally omitted. The DAC paper was not overlooked by coincidence. The 1934 reclassification did not arrive by chance in the same 4-year window when one of the largest industrial expansions in American consumer history was underway. You are not the type of person who looks at that chain of events and calls it a coincidence. That is why you are still watching. The people who kept this knowledge alive, the Polk County butcher, the Ohio Mennonite community, the farmers who never stopped packing crocks because they knew what worked, they were not radicals. They were not conspiracy theorists. They were practical people who understood that a method which had preserved food reliably for generations did not stop working because a federal amendment reclassified its ingredients. They kept doing what worked, and because they did, the knowledge survived long enough to reach you. So here's the question. If your great-grandparents used a method that worked reliably for 200 years proven in field rations, in farming communities, in Mennonite outbuildings across rural Ohio, what would it take for you to learn it? Drop your answer below, because the people who kept this alive deserve to know that the chain did not break. One more thing before you go. The same 1917 USDA manual that contained the salt cure formulas had a second section, a section on soil treatment. Specifically, a method using nothing but wood, ash, and clay that reportedly tripled root vegetable storage life in a standard root cellar without any chemical inputs, simple materials, documented results, available to any household with a garden and an outbuilding. That section was also removed in the 1941 revision, without explanation.